Hello and welcome back to Monster Mondays, a series where I talk about a creature from Dungeons & Dragons and I draw it as we go. Today we're going to be talking about the Gelatinous Cube, one of the most iconic monsters in Dungeons & Dragons, and certainly one of the most feared amongst junior adventurers. So I found a few discrepancies online about when this was actually invented. See, I thought that it first appeared in the first ever monster manual, which was in 1977. Apparently there's also some people suggesting that it actually appeared in the White Box, one of the first editions of D&D, in 1974. But either way, we can put a circle around it in that it was invented in the 1970s and was therefore one of the first monsters to enter into Dungeons & Dragons. It's pretty unique in that it's not lifted from any other mythologies. You know, you won't find this in ancient Greece or ancient Rome. No ancient Egyptians or Norse tales feature the Gelatinous Cube, unlike a lot of the other monsters in the monster manual, and there are a lot of mixed opinions about the Gelatinous Cube. Some people love it, some people hate it. In Britain we call that a Marmite. For those of you unaware of Marmite, it's a kind of spread that is kind of super salty. It's like a yeast extract thing. I'm super not selling it, but it's kind of like a British institution, and their branding is you either love it or hate it. That's their little slogan. And just like Marmite, we have the same situation with the Gelatinous Cube. You either love it or you hate it. Crack.com's Tyler Lynn once called it one of the 15 most idiotic D&D monsters. He said, unless an encounter plays out exactly like the steamroller scene from Austin Powers, we fail to see how the Gelatinous Cube ever kills anybody who's not either glued to the floor or fast asleep. On the other hand, Chris Sims from an online magazine called Comics Alliance once said that there can be absolutely no question of what is the greatest monster in D&D when referring to the cube. But what is it? It's a 15-foot cube, or at least in earlier editions described as a 10-foot cube. In this one it's 15 feet. 5th edition, of clear jelly, basically. Absolutely transparent, just like a block of ice, but made out of jelly or jello. And although I say it's 15 foot now, there are some editions, some settings that suggest otherwise. But there are whispers among the denizens of the Forgotten Realm setting that deep beneath the continent of Faerun, there is one gelatinous cube that has grown to several 100,000 cubic feet in volume. A terrifying thought. So it obviously doesn't look like much. I'm having quite a lot of fun drawing it right now, but it doesn't look like it's doing too much. There's not like any limbs or anything in there. You know, how's it going to kill someone? It's a living creature, believe it or not. It doesn't have a brain or anything like that. But, you know, just like a starfish, it doesn't need a brain to function. It's made out of transparent slime that can move and, has rudimentary intelligence. I think if you think about bacteria and other single-celled organisms, you might be on the right track in terms of this thing's motivations and intelligence level. Now, I mentioned in the last Monster Mondays with the owlbear that Gary Gygax, when he was first kind of coming up with D&D, would get action figures and little figurines from a nearby dime store to represent monsters and to also inspire him to come up with new monsters. And although it's not said anywhere that I can find, I really, really, really hope that the Gelatinous Cube was inspired by desperation, just completely unable to think of what the hell to have fight his explorers, his adventuring party. I would like to hope that Gary Gygax went and found a cube of jelly, or as the Americans call it, jello, from the fridge, and just plonked it on the dungeon mat there and had his adventurers fight actual jelly. That would be fantastic. But we have no idea. We have no idea where Gary came up with this. But since the days of its beginnings, it's evolved, and over the many, many years, people have come to love it and kind of expand on how they think it might operate. And in the 5th edition, we have quite a good idea of how it might live. Inspiration has been drawn from slime molds, I think, which are things in the real world. They're related to fungi, and they're usually single-celled organisms that span kind of damp forests. Basically, once a year, in kind of the autumnal / winter time, they kind of communicate together and expand until they grow into each other, essentially filling a forest with this pulsating slime, basically. There's no better way to say it. Although it has no sensory organs or anything like that, it basically somehow seeks out bacteria and fungi to essentially digest, essentially cleaning the forest, if that makes sense, to sort of like mesh these similarities even further. In some editions, we're told how gelatinous cubes might reproduce, because there's no sort of consensus on how they were created or when they were created. There's no, even in Volo's guide, we don't really find out, where the first appearance of one of these things was. So we have to work under the assumption that they are natural reproducing creatures. Some oozes were spawned presumably by a demon called Jubilex. I might talk about them later on, but demons are capable of creating life in these universes. But in some editions we find out that gelatinous cubes can bud, essentially. If they're confined into a really tight corridor and they can't get out, they might push a little piece of themselves through a tiny hole or into a really confined space, and it'll just make a smaller cube that will eventually grow once it finds enough food into a normal 15 by 15 or 10 by 10 cube. And that's kind of what the slime molds do as well. Once this colony of single-celled organisms spread out to find food and digest everything in their path, when they're kind of finished doing what they're doing, some of the cells form stems and others form spores, and basically reproduce that way. There doesn't seem to be any logic to it, but they just do, and eventually they scatter onto the forest floor just like fungi would. And although they're called slime molds in the real world, the classification in D&D is an ooze. There are multiple different kinds of ooze, and I hope to talk about a few of them. They're fairly similar, so I might lump the rest of the oozes together, but the gelatinous cube is the only one with a kind of shape to it. The other ones are fairly amorphous, so I want to give it its own entry either way. Just like slime molds and their fungi cousins, oozes really, really like warm, dark, wet places, okay? So they naturally gravitate towards kind of caves and nice warm inhabited dungeons, things like that. And this makes them massively deadly, because just like their slime mold cousins, they devour everything organic in their path. They completely dissolve it. As soon as something comes into contact with its skin, with its surface tension skin kind of stuff, anything organic, any organic matter gets pretty much instantly dissolved. What's more, instinctively being drawn towards warmth and movement, but shunning anything too hot. If there are adventurers running through this cave, it's going to naturally gravitate towards them. And they can move, albeit slowly, hence the Austin Powers steamroller remark earlier on. They move really slowly. They move at half a normal human's movement speed, so only 15 feet at a time. It's kind of a bit like It Follows. It's always going to be moving towards you if it can sense you somewhere within the cave. It can sense warmth somewhere within the cave or the dungeon. Just really, really slowly. But it also means if it does end up catching you and you can't escape its gelatinous clutches, you will also be dying and dissolving just as slowly and hopelessly, leading to an agonizing death that you can only see coming. They are large enough, being 15 feet, to fill a whole corridor or a small room or even a pit, and on top of which they are completely invisible to the naked eye. A lot of images depict them as being some kind of colour, just because how the hell do you draw something utterly invisible without great difficulty? But they are supposed to be almost entirely invisible, even in plain sight, even in normal lighting conditions, aside from any hard objects, any inorganic materials that they have floating around them, because although they digest anything organic, they have real trouble with anything inorganic. So they might have kind of skulls and swords and things like that, parts of previous adventurers. Magic things don't tend to get dissolved in there, so if there's a magical chest or a magic item in there, it might not get dissolved. So you're likely to see a few things from its long life floating around inside it, but otherwise difficulty 15 perception check, or maybe even higher if your DM wants to make it a little bit harder to even notice that there is a gelatinous cube in the room or in front of you. So you could just walk into one, you could just be wandering down a corridor and happen to walk into one or fall into a hole that you didn't notice was there and be walking straight into one, unable to escape. And if you walk straight into one or if you let it engulf you, it has an action to engulf someone, then you will slowly dissolve. So that's the gelatinous cube's main action. Basically, it can move, and then engulf includes movement up to its full movement speed as well. So actually it really can move 30 feet per turn. But basically it can occupy any space that other creatures are in as well. So basically if you stand still, doesn't matter how compact you are, how many things are in the area, it can still completely consume you. Or if you walk into it, obviously that the same stuff can happen. And you can make a chance to kind of jump out of the way of it with a dexterity saving throw. But if you fail as it moves towards you, or again if you walk straight into it, the enzymes that it produces, or maybe just the natural acidity of it, will begin to dissolve all organic material that you make up, which mechanically means that you take 3d6 acid damage every single turn until you manage to struggle your way out of there. You can try and do that with a successful strength check, but basically you're kind of like drowning in acid that is so, has so much tension in there, so much pressure that you're trying to swim through jelly that's burning you to death. It's a really hard check. Now your friends can try and save you, they can try and reach you. They can try and make the strength check to pull you out. It's a little bit easier for them to do it because they're not inside trying to swim out of acid. But in doing so, they automatically volunteer to be burned by it. They automatically take the 3d6 acid damage in order to try and help you out. And that's only for the attempt. They might not succeed in getting you out. And that also means they have to be close enough to the cube to do it. So the cube could just decide, if you don't manage it, next time it's just going to jump into you. And it can consume about 4 human-sized things at any given time, or one large-sized thing. It can have like an owlbear or something like that in there as well, all dissolving away. And once it's caught you and it carries on moving, you go with it. You're locked inside it, so it can take you wherever it wants to. Now, I like to think that the surface pressure on something like this must be absolutely enormous for it to be made of a viscous liquid, but so tense as to have defined sides and corners. It must be pretty hard to actually force your way out of a cube. I imagine the best way, if you were kind of caught inside, would be to hope that it would drag itself over like a sharp rock or some sort of object that it couldn't melt, and you just kind of like cling onto that object for dear life. And as it moves away, maybe you could try and pull yourself out of it. But who knows? Many adventurers have lost their lives to it. It's basically a living acid bath trap. A lot of dungeons feature the kind of like pit that you weren't expecting to see, and you fall down into a pit of acid, but this is one that can follow you down the corridor and even follow you back to the village if it so needs to be. So that can be pretty deadly. I mean, you could literally just open a door to a new room and you don't see anything inside because it's just completely invisible, and you could just open the door and just walk straight into one, and you realize you're finding it really hard to breathe, and oh yeah, your skin's melting. So how would you avoid that? What's the best way to notice if the room ahead of you or the corridor or anything like that is actually filled with a gelatinous cube? The best way to notice the presence of a gelatinous cube is, for starters, see if there are any floating objects in the corridor. If there happen to be any like disembodied bones, inorganic weapons, inorganic materials, things like that, just happen to be floating around in the room, you might be walking into a well-fed gelatinous cube. Another good way might be to examine the room to see if there's any dirt, any evidence of bacteria, decay or rotting, or wood, anything like that, any organic materials that don't comprise a living sort of breathing body. Is there any leather bound books in the room, leather sofas? Are there any bearskin rugs in the room up ahead, things like that? If there's not, It could be because a cube has already dissolved them or is currently dissolving them, and you can't see them. It's an ancient cave and there's no fungi, there's nothing rotting at all, you know there's something suspicious. So the cube will basically leave none of that standing. It'll dissolve all of it, it'll devour absolutely everything organic it can find, so it'll leave the room absolutely spotless. This is like Sillet Bang times 1,000, so just look out for a sparkling clean room. It'd be fantastic to think of I imagine that would be fantastic for like a wizard school or like a really pompous mage villain or something like that, who had maybe made tiny gelatinous cubes or keeps baby gelatinous cubes in their home or in their study as like basically a little gelatinous Roomba to kind of move throughout a room and digest all the dirt and bacteria that falls on the floor, instead of having a cleaner or a maid or something like that. Someone who won't clean for themselves and also won't hire anyone to do it for them. Instead, they'll go for the fully D&D version and they'll breed gelatinous cubes in order to be little Roombas. Either way, they can be a fantastic surprise for low-level adventurers. They're only a challenge rating 2 creature, but I feel like they can be really deadly. They're basically, if you use them as a trap, they can be a challenge for just about any rating. They also eat anything organic but also living matter. Is one of their preferences. So it could be useful in higher levels to have intelligent undead use them as basically a shield, because we know that bones and armor and weapons just kind of float effortlessly inside without being digested. The cube doesn't seem to be able to digest them. So if you're really smart and you're an undead, say you're a lich, you could just hop inside a gelatinous cube. Now, engulf specifies, when you're engulfed in a gelatinous cube, the book specifies that you count as having complete cover, even though you can be easily seen. And what that means for you is basically spells that would target you can't do so, and that's effectively to mean that if you're inside a cube, the healer of your party can't, keep healing the damage away from you. You're just going to dissolve away unless you can think of something. But in this scenario, if an undead character managed to actually hop inside one of them, adventurers would have to essentially kill or chip away at the cube enough before that they could reach them, while the undead also wouldn't be harmed. But also they'd have this complete cover as well. Now, it means obviously they couldn't cast spells out of it and so on, but if they're in a dire stretch, or maybe they just want to really piss off the adventurers, then they could just hide inside a cube, laughing silently as the adventurers try and figure out how to get inside without burning themselves to death. Maybe let the cube wander away as they're impervious to all harm from the adventurers inside it. What's more, they're used a lot by villains because they can be coerced. They're intelligent enough. They're not like smart or anything, but we know that they don't like heat and they don't like light. So if you put a lot of torches or a burning brazier in one particular location, you can essentially encourage the gelatinous cube to make its home elsewhere in the dungeon. And unlike its other kind of ooze cousins, the gelatinous cube doesn't innately have the spider climb ability, so it can't force its way up walls. So you can quite easily direct it where you want it to go if you put something that it doesn't like in its way. So a lot of wizards and necromancers and so on have managed to coerce gelatinous cubes into exactly 15 by 15 foot rooms or into pits to devour their enemies if they ever try and foolishly sneak into their lair uninvited. So how can you kill it? How can you fight it? So the first way is, if you can avoid it, it's maybe a good idea. It moves really slowly. You can step to the side if you're in a massive room, but usually these are going to be used in narrow corridors that occupy basically the width of the cube, so you can't really escape it. In which case, if there are any steps nearby, it doesn't have feet, so it can't exactly scale any steps, and again, it doesn't have the ability to stick to walls or anything, so if you manage to get up high, what's it going to do? It can't affect you. So if you essentially prolong the problem, or if there are steps to basically leave or get out of that floor of the dungeon, you're fine. You can just literally go up the steps and it can't reach you. But if you really do want to attack this thing, normal weapons do do affect it. It's only got an armor class of 6, so almost anyone's going to be hitting this thing all the time. I imagine you're kind of, carving it to pieces, just like real jelly. I mean, you could probably even use a spoon to cut it at an armor class of 6. It has no weapon immunities whatsoever. Bludgeoning damage will even hurt it. But if you come into contact with it, if you're in close combat range, then it can easily just engulf you. Your DM might also say that the tension of it is so strong that you get pulled into it if you use a combat weapon on it. There's no rules for that, but they might want to make it even more difficult by doing that. So maybe use ranged weapons or spells to affect it. But you can certainly hit it normally, basically. In some editions of D&D, large bodies of water kind of dissolve oozes and slimes. Usually it has to be a body of water that is more volume than the cube or the slime itself, just because, they're a viscous liquid, so if you put it in another liquid, there's a chance that it'll just diffuse and spread out. Now, there's nothing specifically in the rules about it in this case. In 5e, I mean, we've all seen, if you put olive oil in the bottom of a glass and then you pour water over the top of it, they don't diffuse. The tension is so different that they just stay in layers. So that may not work, but it's worth a try. They are a living creature, so in some editions it specifies that they have to breathe air. Now, it has condition immunities to an awful lot of stuff, like being blinded and charmed, deafened, exhausted, frightened, knocked prone, all this kind of stuff, but it's not immune to suffocation. So technically, I mean, your DM could rule differently here. I mean, it doesn't look like it needs lungs or anything like that, but there are a lot of single-celled organisms, there are a lot of even multi-celled organisms like little flatworms that absorb air and oxygen through osmosis and don't need lungs or anything like that. So a gelatinous cube could be doing the same, and if you were to put it in an airtight box, eventually it might die. But again, with something that's not specified in the rules, that would be up to your DM. And we also know that when you are attacked by a gelatinous cube, it deals acid damage. Now, we don't know whether acid damage just means it burns you and it erodes you, or if it's specifically actually acid damage, if you throw something heavily alkaline on someone, it's going to do the same effects as acid, so it would probably fall under the category of acid damage in D&D because we know what it means. They're not going to specify alkaline damage. That's going to be really way too specific. So we don't know if a gelatinous cube is acidic or alkaline, or however it manages to deal acid damage to you. But if it does deal acid damage, and again that's kind of up to your DM, you might try neutralizing that acid. Now, the gelatinous cube seems to be like a slime mold in that it's going to be a lot of stuff, maybe a colony of organisms, maybe it's one massive organism that produce a lot of enzymes that are acidic. But if it's literally a sentient cube of acid, putting something alkaline in it might neutralize it and cause it to basically become water-like. At least it wouldn't burn you anymore, or at the very least it might, if we were to eat a load of stuff that was super alkaline, neutralize our stomach acids, it would make us really sick. We'd start throwing up. So it might cause the gelatinous cube to regurgitate all the stuff that's inside it, make it really unwell, make it, unable to burn you. I mean, you'd still have the problem of being engulfed by it and thus not being able to breathe inside it because there's going to be no air in there if it did engulf you. But the way I would play that out as a DM is if someone threw something alkaline into it, I would maybe reduce the acid damage in dice levels, so it's 3d6 at the moment. I would maybe make it 3d4, or I'd make it 2d6, something like that, to kind of show that maybe, actually it is less acidic now because of what you put in there. But there's a chance, depending on your GM's ruling, your DM's ruling, that neutralizing the acid, changing the pH of a gelatinous cube, could kill it. So that is another way. Anyway guys, I hope you liked this video. If you did, make sure to leave a little thumbs up and also subscribe for more videos like this every week. We put out 2 videos every week at the moment, one on Monday and one on Friday. So make sure to stay tuned by subscribing and maybe share this with someone who you think might find it interesting as well. Until next time, I'll see you later.